Hello, students. Welcome to lecture number 1, which follows the introductory lecture. We will be today covering chapter 1 of your text. Let me go through my outline, and then we'll come back and look at some of the PowerPoints or outline that the text has to make sure that we cover those things that I think are most important from the text. Again, referring back to the text, don't forget to look at your syllabus, because your syllabus has the how to get the digital or online version of the text, the key that you will need, it's a specific number, etc. So make sure you look at the syllabus to get to understand how to get the text. Now, chapter 1, we're talking about the law in general, and from chapter 2 onward, we're going to talk about different types of law, different areas. For example, we might talk about contract law in a subsequent week. We will. And then we might talk about insurance. And we'll talk about products liability law. But we're trying to talk about the law as a general concept today. And simply put, a law is nothing more than rules enforcing relationships between individuals, between an individual and a company, between an individual and society, usually government. So, for example, if the state is arresting someone for such and such violation, let's say, they stole a car. Well, again, the law are just the rules for that relationship and what one may or may not do. Now, let's just think about the laws you might encounter. Okay, you went to work this morning, hypothetically. You drove to work. So you had to have a driver's license issued by the state of Oklahoma. That's one set of laws. You had to follow traffic laws. Now, you had to follow the city laws if you went on city streets. You had to follow county laws if you went on a county highway. If you went on, you might have to follow state laws as well if you went on the turnpike. So you've incurred the second type of loss just by getting in your car, starting to drive. Now you have an accident, traffic accident on the way. Who's liable? Well, that's civil law that we have to look at. Were you going too fast? Is the policeman going to issue you a ticket? Well, that's criminal law if he issues you a ticket. Once you get sued, again, civil law between two people. Okay, you finally make it to work. Sit down, start up your computer. Well, in order to use your computer, you have a software license, don't you? That's intellectual property law. You have to be authorized to use that. While you're sitting there minding your own business working, your pervy boss comes and starts giving you a shoulder massage. Well, that's employee harassment. And indeed, that's usually federal labor law, so another type of law. You get up, go to the bathroom to escape your weird boss, and you slip and fall. Well, you have two more kinds of laws that are relevant to you at that point. One is OSHA, which is a federal safety law. Is your workplace safe? And then what if you are hurt so bad that you have to have medical compensation? That's work comp law. So here by 9:30 in the morning at your job, you've encountered, 8, 9 different types of laws. So we're in this law, we're going to focus primarily on how businesses are impacted by laws and the laws that businesses should consider so they don't get in trouble, so they're sort of successful, etc. Now, where do we see laws? Where do we find laws? Well, let's first talk about the primary sources of law. By primary, I mean there's a difference between primary and secondary. Primary is places that issue the law itself. Since you're a U.S. MBA class, we're going to talk about the supreme law of the U.S. That is basically the Constitution. We agreed on the scope of the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the U.S. So there's nothing that you can do or a state can do that is contrary to the Constitution. A judge will set aside a law if it's contrary to the Constitution. For an example, number of years ago, there was a case called Obergefell versus Hodges. And the Supreme Court, and I'm reading here, ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed not only to different sex couples, but same-sex couples, because of the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So this one case law decided under the Constitution of the United States reversed 200 plus years of existing other federal laws, state laws, etc., because it was the highest law, constitutional law, by the highest court, the U.S. Supreme Court. It overruled everything else in the area that was affected by that decision. Now, don't forget, Constitution comes back. We have 3 branches of government. I'm not going to go back to your 8th grade, sociology class, but at this point you should know that we have, let's start with legislative, executive, and judicial. And to make it very simple, think of different buildings they sit in. The legislative, in D.C., you'll see Congress, and that's basically the House of Representatives and the senators. And we'll have similar things in various states, in the states. So they will pass a law, okay? That is a statute. They will send it to the executive branch, the president, and he can sign it or veto or not sign it. Not signing it, I believe, is called a pocket veto. But then the Congress can override a veto if they have enough. But generally, House and Senate will pass the bill, send it to the White House, it's signed, and it becomes law. Excuse me. And that if it's ever challenged as being unconstitutional, then who will decide that? The judicial branch. So the easiest way to remember this is the legislative branch legislates. They come up with legislation. The executive branch is the chief executive. It's everything, the president and all his departments, everything under him. The judicial are judges, judicial. They interpret the law. Now, let's see. You'll have similar, so let's talk about statutes. That's legislation that's been passed, and then they literally put it in the code books, digitally or hard copy, of the U.S. government or the state that it's in, because similar to the federal, if the law has passed in the state, it was the legislature, went to the governor, and then it was codified. It becomes part of the official statutes of the state. In the federal system, it becomes a federal statute, part of the entire federal statutes, okay? So you'll find, for example, the federal statutes or federal laws in what's called the U.S. Code. You can find this, and you don't need to memorize this, but you can find this at gpo.gov, gpo.gov, as well as 100 other websites. You can literally look up any reference to any statute by just going online and finding it. It's real transparency. You can also find the Constitution under there. State statutes, let's look at Oklahoma. By the way, both the federal sort of follows a similar pattern. State of Oklahoma, they're divided into codes, into titles. So Title I through Title whatever, and they're by subject matter. So, for example, Title 12 is civil procedure in courts, how the courts operate. Title 8 happens to be about cemeteries. I just pulled up a few examples. 12A is business commercial code. 21 is crimes and punishments. So if you ever get arrested by the state highway patrolman, for example, you'll see a violation of 21 Oklahoma statute and then the specific number of the statute, okay, because you violated the Oklahoma Criminal Code. That's the state legislation. Municipalities will have a little sort of similar, cities, if you will, they'll have codes. And a lot of times they'll try not to have laws that step on federal or state, but for example, they'll have zoning. Or, so for example, if you get a ticket, if you get a ticket from a highway patrolman, you'll probably have to go to a state court downtown in Tulsa. If you get a ticket from a city of Tulsa policeman, then you theoretically go to a different court for that ticket in the municipal building. So again, federal, state, and then many cities have similar paradigms, or their laws take a similar shape. Now, now we've talked about how laws are promulgated, how they come about. Let's now talk about a type of law called administrative law. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, let's go over to the executive branch. At the time of this filming, President Biden is the president, and he is the chief executive. And so in a certain way, you think of him just like an executive of a business. He heads various agencies: Department of State, Department of Commerce, the Environmental Protection Agency, Homeland Security, etc. So he's the boss over these federal agencies. Now, each of these agencies will promulgate and publish their own rules and enforce them, I might add. They're like legislation, except they're passed by that branch, that federal agency, I guess is the best way to say it. Let me give you an example. Going back to Congress, they pass a bill that says, hey, we should have clean air. But at the end of the day, that's pretty vague, isn't it? So the Congress and the president, they give their authority, they delegate the authority to decide the specifics of how to enforce the clean air rules, to make rules called regulations by a federal agency. So the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, does promulgate, issue, publish rules that say, that means your car can only expel X percent of carbon dioxide, and fossil fuel plants, they're can only put out so much pollutants, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the regulations that are passed by these executive branch administrative agencies. So they kind of look like legislation, but they're specific federal agency. You can find those in what's known as the Code of Federal Regulations. Makes sense, right? It's the Code of Federal Regulations, not statutes, not the United States Code, but the Code of Federal Regulations. All right, so you can look them up. They're online, so many places. Okay, so we've talked about legislation which becomes statute, state and federal. We've talked about administrative agencies that do regulations. Okay, let's go to another kind of law. And maybe the best way to understand is the first law we talked about, it originated with the legislative branch. They legislated statutes. The second type of law we talked about originated with the administrative or executive branch and his administrative agencies. Okay, now we're going over to the judges. Judges, or the judicial branch, whether it's federal or state, or even cities for that matter, they will, of course, interpret all the laws that these agencies and Congress, for example, have passed and decide, is it constitutional? Someone is coming before to sue someone else. What does the law say about that? So there are, the judges will do that. What judges? Well, generally, there are 3 layers, hierarchy of judges. You will generally, and there are exceptions to these rules, that's why I say generally, you'll generally down here have trial courts. So you sue me because I run into with my car, you're going to go to the trial court and have a trial, Was Kevin speeding? And then he ran into me with his car. Now, let's say that you lose, I win, you lose at the trial court. You can appeal that to an appellate court. Appeal the decision to an appellate court. So that's number 2. That's a higher court. Let's say you lose there, then your next and usually your final chance is to go to a Supreme Court. So if you have sued me in state court, you'll be at a state trial court, state appellate court, Oklahoma Supreme Court. If you have sued me in federal court, you go to a federal district court, then a federal appellate court, and then the United States Supreme Court. Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, when you go downtown, the courts are literally across from each other. You'll see the courthouse here, the library, and then the federal courthouse. So you'll see the state courthouse, library, and federal courthouse. They're just separate buildings based on who runs them and the type of laws that go before them. We'll get much more into that. When we go back through the outline, I'm going to talk to you about case law and how you read it when you're reading a case online. Again, just so you understand, if you have to look up a case, you're not going to have to go do research or anything in this law. Now, so let's talk about the terminology. You've sued me, so let's talk about some of the terms that are used once you sued. Parties to a lawsuit. Parties. You sue me, so you are the plaintiff. Again, you're the plaintiff. I am defending the lawsuit, so I am the defendant. Plaintiff, defendant. Okay? If we go up to an appellate court after the trial court's done, whoever appeals is the appellant, and the other party is the appellee. Okay? Now, let's talk about when a court actually issues a decision. All right? Judges can issue written decisions. They don't always have to, but judges may issue written decisions. And let's think about federal court. That's probably the easiest right now. So a judge might have a trial, and then he'll issue a written opinion on how it went. Let's presume there's no jury, because often there's not. You don't have to have a jury, but in many cases you can demand a jury. But a lot of the business litigation you see may not have a jury, they'll have a judge. So they'll do that decision. Well, then it goes up to the appellate court and Supreme Court. Well, you have a single trial court judge. When you sued me, there's only one judge. When we appeal it, we don't go there and try it again. We send them the written record of our trial. And there are multiple judges. You know, there could be 3 en banc, 5, 7. There could be many judges depending on what state, federal or state, etc. And they will look at what happened at the trial court on the written record. We can't retry it there. And then they will issue the decision. If they all agree on the decision, then it's unanimous. We all agree. But let's say we have 5 judges. 4 agree and 1 doesn't. Well, there is a majority opinion. 4 have decided the case. 1 has dissented, a dissentant. And so if he writes his own opinion, so the appellate court, they'll write their opinion. This is why we decided that the trial court was right or wrong. They'll have their opinion. And then the dissenter might have a dissenting opinion. He says, oh, I disagree with them, and this is why. Okay. Sometimes these 4 each want to write their own, so you can have a plurality opinion. So the key is the appellate courts are issuing an opinion. Does this stand, yes or no? Do we send it back for retrial, yes or no? Now, let's get that completely out of your head, and let's move over to, in general, sources. Where do we find law? Not where do they come from, legislation, administrative agencies, cities. No, not where they come from. When we're researching, where do we find the law? Okay? Primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources we've already talked about. Statutes. which are legislation that's signed. Regulations issued by administrative agencies, city codes, that is primary sources, because you're literally looking at the document itself. I don't mean to use a religious setting, but let's say the Bible, the Quran, any religious text. The text itself, or let's say a great work of literature, it really doesn't matter for purpose of this metaphor, but the text of that book itself is the primary law, isn't it? That's what we're talking about. We can read it and see it. People's commentaries about that are secondary sources. So again, primary source is the law itself, and secondary is commentaries, professors, lawyers, etc., that are saying, well, I want to think about this, and etc. Now, primary sources, let's say a judge, the U.S. Supreme Court comes out with an opinion. That has precedential value. Almost always, subsequently, courts must follow that Supreme Court opinion. It's known as having precedential value. It's a precedent. But if someone just makes a comment about a case, that's not precedential. A court doesn't have to follow it. That's their opinion. It might be persuasive. Also, for example, if our Oklahoma Supreme Court decides something, that's precedent. We have to follow that. But if somebody in Ohio says, we've never had a case on this specific factual set, this set of facts, they may say, well, let's look. We've never had this precedent. Let's look at other states. Oh, Oklahoma had a similar, and they decided this. We're going to follow that. That doesn't mean they're following it as a precedent. That is, they don't have to follow Oklahoma law. They're just saying it's persuasive. So, precedential versus persuasive. Okay, now let's talk about the hierarchy. Who rules who when it comes to law? Who's the big dog? We've already talked about U.S. Constitution takes precedence over federal statutes that are passed by Congress. Federal statutes take precedence over state laws. State law takes precedence over local ordinance, city laws basically, which takes precedence over administrative regulations and rulings. Okay, so there's a hierarchy. A judge, for example, would have to, he couldn't look down to a city ordinance and say, oh, this is more important than the U.S. Constitution. No, he would say, this down here is contrary to the U.S. Constitution. I'm setting it aside. It's no good. All right, now, when you're researching, and again, you're not going to have to research, but some of you might go to law school. Sometimes you might actually be looking up similar cases. When you can do that. It's available online now. You're a manager. Your lawyer sends you a case. You're a manager. You say, oh my gosh, we have this legal decision. Do we do this or this? That you can actually do some research online. So when you're reading something, where to find it is simply called the citation. If it's a statute, we've already talked about this. It's such and such title, United States Code, such and such section. Same thing with state. Chapter such and such, Oklahoma statute, and the specific section. All right. If you're talking about administrative law, we've already talked about that. That's in the federal code of federal regulations. If you're talking about case law, in other words, judge-made law or common law, you look at usually the trial court opinions. Remember the 3 levels are not published. Often an appellate opinion and Supreme Court are published, and you can find them. And then once you research them, you can say, this is definitely the law, because here it is by the judge. He took this statute, he interpreted this law and prior cases and etc. and published it. And once it's published, that's law. That's case law or common law. Okay. Those decisions are in reporters, if you will. They've been reported. So you can find them in a number of things. So for example, federal cases, you could find them online, but there are certain private companies that actually collect them in numerical order based on when they came, a chronological order, I guess I should say. And you can research them for a cost, usually online, by just doing a Boolean logic search, just like a Google search, similar to that, okay? Some are unofficial reports, unpublished, so they don't have precedential value. You don't have to follow them, but they're of interest and they might be persuasive. But published official reports do have precedential follow. You do have to follow them. Let's see. I'm going to switch you over to see my screen for a minute. And this is an example of a case that is in one of these reporters. If you'll follow the cursor here, you'll see it's found in the West Federal Reporter. Well, that's because it's federal courts, United States Court of Appeals. Here's the name. Remember, the person that appealed it is the appellant, and someone appealed an order of the Internal Revenue, the IRS. Fight the man. So in any event, that gets a case number. We can see that came out in 1990. It was originally filed. And then the Court of Appeals, a year later in 1991, issued this opinion. Well, this right here, the constitutional law and witnesses, that is not from the court. And by the way, if you have any problems seeing this, I'm going to be publishing this also with the lecture, so you'll be able to look at this at your own time. But the reporter puts these topical issues in here, makes it easier to research. This case talks about constitutional law and this numbered aspect of it. And it also talks about witnesses. And then you see the paragraph behind it. Okay. Here you say who the attorneys were. Here are the judges. 1, 2, 3. Federal circuit judges, appellate judges, listen to it. Per curiam, they all agreed. And then you'll see here that they start going through the facts, and then they go through the law. So let's look right here. The right to free exercise of religion, which is guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution, is a protected constitutional right, et cetera, et cetera. Basically they're saying it's very rare that the IRS could do something that outweighs this protected right of religion. I think a big one we're going to see is, I'm suspecting the next 10, 20 years, you'll see churches lose their tax exempt status. And so there'll be cases like crazy about, wait a minute, exercise of religion, what can the IRS do? So you go down, you see their reasoning, you see they've cited some things, and then you'll see at the very end, we reverse the decision of the tax court and remand it back, so they have to retry it. Okay, so this is primary law. This is an actual case opinion. And here comes secondary law. This reporter says, here are we are gathering these various cases together that have to do with this issue. And this one just has to be assumption of risk. Somebody goes into a theater late. You're going to watch a movie. It's late. You fall down, break your leg. Can you sue the theater? Well, the theater is going to say you assumed the risk. You walked in late. The lights were down. And so you start looking at these cases and see what the courts have said about that. It has nothing to do with the IRS case. These are just examples of the published opinions. Okay, let's go back to, you have my apology, to the camera on me, which you won't have to endure much longer. Concept of stare decisis, that's important for you to remember. That means that a court has decided it and you have to follow it. For example, once the Supreme Court has now said that same-sex marriage is a right, then other courts just can't ignore that. They have to follow that. Having to follow that is called stare decisis. So remember that. I don't remember if that's on a test, but that's a good test question. Sometimes, rarely, courts will not follow, but it's not like a lower court can overturn a higher court. A high court can look at its own decisions and say, you know what, there are reasons we shouldn't follow that. Let me give you a good example. Slavery was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court for, good heavens, almost 100 years. And even, that you had to return a slave to a slave state. I mean, there were a bunch of just horrendous U.S. Supreme Court cases. And finally, there was a Supreme Court number of cases, but a Supreme Court case that said, you know what, we're not going to follow those prior. That's not consistent with the Constitution. Slavery it denies equal protection, due process, all sorts of constitutional problems. We're not going to follow it. So that is an instance where usually a court follows the previous case, stare decisis. This court said, nope, we're going to overturn that. We think it is not sound. All right. Let's see. We talked about precedents. When do you not follow stare decisis? Legal reasoning, I'll show you in the outline in a minute. Okay, here's, we've already talked about federal law versus state law, civil law versus criminal law. Let's touch on that real quick. I'm speeding and run into your car and cause injury. If I get a ticket or get arrested, the law used to arrest me is, of course, criminal law. The state is arresting me, not you. It's criminal law, and only the state, and by state I mean this state or the federal state, has the right, or the city or the county, whatever government entity, has the right to enforce that. You don't. But you could sue me for damages, your medical damages, your car damages, your loss of work, etc. But that wouldn't be the state coming to get me. That would be you suing me, two private individuals. That is civil law. So criminal law, if the government arrests me. Civil law, if it's two private individuals, an individual and a business, two businesses, etc., but it's not the state. Maybe the way to remember civil law is it's not very civil because we're suing each other. Okay. Now, here's kind of a tough concept. Substantive law versus procedural law. All right. This is a toughie. So stay with me here. When I'm looking at the decisions that we just talked about, those are the substance of the law. When I look at the federal regulations, when I look at statutes, those laws tell me this is the law. However, how do you enforce that? So what court do I go to? Can I present witnesses? Can I examine you? If I get a judgment, how do I enforce the judgment against you? Those are all procedural questions as opposed to substantive. I apologize for the sports metaphor, but if you're playing football, American football, the goal, if you will, is to cross the goal line and score, or kick a field goal, essentially to score. But how can you do it, and what is not legal, the referees are going to tell you. So the substance is the objective of scoring. The procedure is how you can and can't do that. Okay? Now, I'm going to move you to the outline from the book, and let's just see if there are some that we need to elaborate on. I'm going to go through this quickly. I apologize. You can read these on your own. I'm going to give to you and just make sure that which ones we covered, which ones we haven't. This is kind of a okay little diagram that says, when I'm making a business decision, I'm going to quit carrying this product line. We're going to buy from them. We're going to market it this way. You can see all the different types of law that might be impacted. gee, we're going to sell it this way. Well, there might be environmental laws that say you can't manufacture that way and you can't sell that way. It's going to leak such and such. How can we advertise? Internet law. How do you sell? Product liability. Can we get sued? So this just basically shows the various types of law, if you will, that business managers such as yourself will be encountering every day. Primary, secondary, con law, admin law. We've talked about this. Don't worry about courts of equity. Don't worry about that. We talked about stare decisis, binding authority, persuasive authority. Oh, we've covered so much. Legal reasoning, don't worry about that. If you go to law school, you need that. If there's a test question on it, that's probably the answer right there. I can't remember if there's a test question or not, but that just shows the IRAC, or how lawyers and how judges decide cases. What is the legal issue in front of us? What is the rule? In other words, what's the law? What are the facts? Okay, how do these facts apply to that rule? That's our conclusion. We talked to common law, restatement. Restatement law is a secondary law source that a bunch of academics get together and say, hey, we've collected all these cases from all over. This is the secondary source, and this is sort of a treatise, if you will, that you can read about the law in general. That's a nice secondary source. They're excellent. Forget schools of thought. I don't care about those. Don't care about that. Don't care about that. Don't care about that. You don't need that. That's so metaphor. That's so ethereal. Oh my gosh, I can't even say it. You don't need it. Okay. We talked about substantive procedure, civil, criminal. Let's see. Let's keep going. We talked about citations. How do you find things? Rules and regulations. Types of courts. Reporters. You can read through those. There's different, how a case is cited. The people, who's suing whom. And then you see the reporter that it's in. The types of what we call our terminology in a lawsuit. More terminology. And that is it. Okay. So folks, we've completed lecture number 1. Thanks for staying with me, and look forward to speaking to you again on lecture number 2.